Get her out of my house. Not a whisper, not a murmur to a subordinate behind a closed door. A command delivered at full volume in front of everyone seated at the breakfast table, the two junior executives, the household manager wringing her hands by the pantry door, and the three children frozen over their half-eaten plates of eggs. He didn't even look up from his phone when he said it. Just flicked two fingers toward the doorway like he was dismissing a fly. I want her gone before I finish my coffee. And tell HR not to bother with a reference. The woman he was talking about stood by the sideboard, a ceramic serving dish held in both hands, still warm from the oven. She was 61 years old. She had worked in that house for 19 years. And she did not flinch. She set the dish down gently, the way you set down something you respect. She folded her hands in front of her, looked across the room at the man who had just ended her livelihood over his morning coffee, and said, quietly, "Yes, sir, that was it." No tears, no argument, no scene. Nobody at that table said a word. The two executives found something fascinating to study on their own plates. The household manager took a step backward through the pantry door as though the floor had become uncertain. Even the children, his own blood, went still and small in their chairs. He had no idea who she really was. He had no idea what he had just set in motion. And in 11 days, he would stand in that same breakfast room, in front of those same people. And his face would do something that no one at that table had ever seen it do before. Have you ever been dismissed, truly dismissed, by someone who assumed they knew exactly who you were and exactly how little you mattered? Hold that feeling, because this story is for you. Let me take you back, 19 years back, to the morning it all began. The house sat at the end of a private road in Fairview Hills, the kind of neighborhood where the mailboxes have brass fixtures and the hedges are trimmed on a schedule. The Whitmore estate, and the family called it that without irony an estate, was 11,000 square feet of imported limestone and reclaimed hardwood. The kind of home that tells you everything about who lives inside before you ever ring the bell. Preston Whitmore III had inherited his grandfather's construction materials company at 32, doubled it by 40, and turned it into a vertically integrated real estate development empire by 47. He was, by every financial measure that mattered to Preston Whitmore III, an exceptional man. Forbes had agreed with him twice. The Whitmore Group employed 4,000 people in 7 states. His name was on a business school atrium and a children's hospital wing, though, as the people who worked closest to him would confide carefully. Only to people they trusted, the hospital donation had come after a particularly unfavorable audit season, and the timing was what it was. He was the kind of man who moved through rooms as though they had been constructed specifically to receive him. Tall, silver-haired, with a handshake engineered over decades to communicate authority. He had been married twice. His first wife, Catherine, had given him 3 children and died of a cardiac event when the youngest was 4 years old. His second wife, Margot, had given him a prenuptial agreement he'd underestimated and a divorce settlement that had cost him 11 months of sleep and $47 million. He did not speak of Margot. When the children mentioned her name by accident, a particular stillness came over him that everyone in the household had learned to read as a weather warning. The 3 children, Harrison, now 23 and working in the company's acquisitions division, Olivia, 19 and in her first year at Emory, and James, 17 and counting the months until he could follow his sister, lived in the house during school breaks and the summer. They were, in the way of children, raised with every material advantage and one profound emotional deficit. Well-mannered and carefully contained the way certain plants grow around an obstacle, upward, always upward, but at an angle that speaks to what they've been growing away from. It was into this house, on a Tuesday morning in early March, 19 years ago, that Dorothea Elaine May first walked. She had been sent by a domestic staffing agency. She was 42 years old. She wore a pressed gray uniform that she'd bought herself because the agency didn't provide one, and she carried a small canvas bag that held her lunch, a notepad for taking down preferences, and a devotional book she'd been reading in chapters since the year her mother passed. She had taken 2 buses to get there. The second one had been 40 minutes late. She had still arrived 7 minutes early. The household manager at the time, a brisk woman named Mrs. Fowler, who had since retired to Tucson, had walked Dorothea through the house with the efficiency of someone conducting a fire drill rather than an orientation. The kitchen was here. The laundry was here. Mr. Whitmore took his coffee at exactly 6:55, and he took it black with 1 level teaspoon of raw sugar, not processed sugar, raw sugar. The difference being important, and the consequence of forgetting it being something Mrs. Fowler described only as unpleasant. The children were not to be disturbed during study hours. Mr. Whitmore's study was off limits entirely. The cut flowers in the front hall were replaced on Mondays. Dorothea listened. She took notes. She asked 2 questions, both of them practical. She thanked Mrs. Fowler for her time. What nobody told her, what she would only learn in the quiet accumulation of months, was the emotional architecture of the house. That Harrison, who was 4 at the time and already the most like his father in bearing, still sometimes woke in the night calling for a mother who wasn't there. That Olivia, just 2 years old and already solemn-eyed in a way that made strangers stop and look at her twice, had a particular way of wrapping her arms around her own waist when she was frightened. That James, the baby, 8 months old and the quietest infant Dorothea had ever encountered, had learned very early that crying did not reliably produce comfort. She learned all of this the way you learn everything essential, slowly, by showing up, day after day, and paying attention. By the end of that first month, Harrison had started waiting by the kitchen door at 6:45 in the morning, not because breakfast wasn't ready, but because Dorothea talked to him while she cooked. Not baby talk, not the performed cheerfulness that adults sometimes offer children as a substitute for genuine attention. She talked to him like someone worth talking to. She told him about the cardinals that visited the feeder outside the kitchen window and why they were always the male birds who were red. She told him that the biscuits she was making were her mother's recipe and that her mother had been the best baker in Claiborne County, Mississippi, and that the secret was cold butter and a light hand. Harrison had listened with his chin in his palms and absorbed every word. By the end of the first year, Dorothea had become the fixed point around which the emotional life of that house oriented itself. Not officially, of course. Officially, she was the housekeeper. She cleaned and cooked and managed the household inventory and coordinated the other staff, and on Thursdays she supervised the deep cleaning that Mr. Whitmore required, and on Fridays she prepared the week's menus for his approval, which he gave with a nod or withheld with a silence that meant start over. Her salary was $140 a month. She had negotiated it up from the initial offer of $1,600, a fact that she considered one of her life's quiet victories, and that Preston Whitmore had entirely forgotten within a week. But what she was, in the lived reality of that house, was something that no line on an employment contract had ever anticipated. She was the person who remembered what each child liked for breakfast on their birthday. She was the person who kept the growth chart penciled on the inside of the pantry door. She had asked permission for that one. And the permission had been granted with the kind of distracted wave that meant he hadn't really heard the question. She was the person who stayed late the night Harrison was in the emergency room with a broken arm from a skateboard accident and Preston was in Singapore on a deal and the nanny had called in sick, who sat in that waiting room under the fluorescent lights for 4 hours reading to a frightened 8-year-old from a dog-eared copy of a National Geographic she'd found in the waiting room magazine. Rack. She was the person who, when Olivia was 7 years old and came into the kitchen holding a framed photograph of Catherine Whitmore and asked, "Miss Dorothea, was she nice?" had set down her dish towel and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Baby, from everything I can see, she must have been remarkable. Because look at you." Olivia had climbed into her lap. She was 7 years old and she had not been rocked in years, and Dorothea had held her and rocked her and let her cry herself empty, and afterward had wiped her face and given her a biscuit, and they had never spoken of it directly again. But it had happened. It had been real. And Olivia had never forgotten. That is the kind of thing that does not show up on a resume. The kind of thing that 19 years of small and irreplaceable moments builds into something that cannot be named, only felt, like the structural integrity of a house. You don't notice it until something tries to tear it apart. The object Dorothea had carried with her through all 19 of those years was a small thing. A brooch. It had belonged to her mother Elaine, who had received it from her own mother, whose name had also been Dorothea, the original Dorothea, the one the family called Dottie May. It was gold-toned, not solid gold, the kind of gold that is honest about what it is, shaped like a small magnolia blossom with a tiny chip of white enamel at the center of each petal. 5 petals. Her grandmother had counted them out for her once when Dorothea was small and said, 5 for faith, hope, love, dignity, and the 5th one is the one that nobody can take from you, and that's your name. She wore it pinned to the inside of her uniform every day, not on the outside where it might seem presumptuous or out of place, on the inside where she could feel it against her sternum, where it was hers. It was a private thing, a sacred thing. In 19 years she had mentioned it to exactly one person in that house. Olivia, understand what the Whitmore household had become in those 19 years. It had become, in all the ways that matter when you strip away square footage and net worth, a house that functioned because of one woman. The household manager who had replaced Mrs. Fowler, a younger man named Gerald who was efficient but cold, had learned quickly that Dorothea was the institutional memory, the relational infrastructure, the person who knew that the second dishwasher had a quirk with the bottom rack and that Harrison was allergic to tarragon though it wasn't in any of his formal medical records, and that the furnace filter needed to be checked in September, even though the service contract said October. He had the good sense to defer to her on anything operational, and she had the good sense to let him keep his dignity while she did it. The children had grown. Harrison was now at the company, wearing his father's gravity like a suit he'd inherited along with the job title. Olivia had grown into something that Dorothea privately thought of as the best possible version of the Whitmore family. The intelligence without the cruelty, the drive without the contempt, the ambition pointed outward rather than downward. And James, the quiet baby, had grown into a lanky 17-year-old who played guitar badly and brilliantly in equal measure and who still sometimes came into the kitchen after dinner and sat at the island and talked to Dorothea the way Harrison had when he was 4, just to fill the air with something warm. Preston Whitmore himself had, if anything, grown harder with prosperity. There is a particular quality that unchecked success can develop in a certain kind of man. A thinning of the membrane between preference and entitlement, between authority and cruelty. He had always been demanding. In the years after Margot left, he had become something else. Sharper, colder, more prone to the kind of remark that lands with the precise weight of the contempt intended. He had taken to having a working breakfast twice a week, bringing 2 or 3 junior executives to the house at 7 in the morning for a power display that seemed to serve no business purpose that anyone could identify, but that everyone understood was about something else, about being seen in a certain way in a certain setting by people whose careers he controlled. Gerald had noted diplomatically that the working breakfasts created complications for the kitchen schedule. Preston had looked at him with the precise calibration of a man who does not need to say anything more than what his expression has already said, and Gerald had said nothing further on the subject. It was during one of these working breakfasts on a Tuesday in October that it began. The 2 executives were Brendan Marsh and Keisha Okafor, both from the company's development division, both there to present preliminary figures on a resort acquisition in the Carolina Mountains. They had arrived at 6:50, sat where they were directed and arranged their materials with the neat anxiety of people who have learned to be ready for anything in Preston Whitmore's presence. Dorothea had been in the kitchen since 5:30. Sausage, eggs, scrambled soft the way he took them, biscuits from scratch. She had never used a canned biscuit in 19 years, and she was not going to start now. Fresh orange juice, which she squeezed herself because he had once made a remark about the difference between fresh and carton that she had written in her notepad and never forgotten. A fruit arrangement that Gerald had specified must look architectural, a word that had made Dorothea pause and then produce something with melon and berries that even she privately admitted was attractive. She had carried the first serving dishes to the dining room at 7 exactly, precisely as he expected, laid them without a sound, and returned to the kitchen for the biscuit basket. She didn't hear the beginning of the conversation. She came back through the door with the biscuits in time to hear the end of it. Preston was showing Brendan Marsh something on his phone, a photograph it seemed. The way they were both leaning in, and he said, in a voice designed to carry, the Hendersons recommended her for the gala committee, if you can believe that. 25-year family name, and they put her up for the gala committee. There was a beat of well-practiced laughter from Brendan Marsh. Some things you just can't fix. It was the kind of remark that arrived in the room and did not leave it. Keisha Okafor looked at her notepad. James, who had come down early and was eating at the far end of the table, looked at his orange juice. Nobody said anything. Dorothea set the biscuits down. She stepped back toward the sideboard where she was meant to stand in readiness, hands folded, invisible the way the room required her to be invisible. Preston looked up then, for the first time, and saw her. Something moved across his face, not guilt, not recognition of what he'd just said or who had just heard it. Something else, something that was less an emotion than a recalibration. He looked at her the way a man looks at furniture he is thinking of replacing. "Gerald," he said, though Gerald was in the kitchen. He said it to the room. Then he said, louder, "Gerald." Gerald appeared in the doorway. "How long has Dorothea been on staff?" Gerald looked briefly at Dorothea and then back at Preston. 19 years, sir." A pause. The kind of pause that has a shape to it. "That's a long time." Another pause. "I want to refresh." "New staff. Put in the paperwork today." The room went very quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Gerald's face went entirely professional, the way faces go when they are hiding what they actually look like underneath. Brendan Marsh appeared to have found something in his folder that required careful study. Keisha Okafor put her pen down on the table, which was a small, precise, brave thing, and nobody noticed except Dorothea. "Yes, sir," Gerald said. "Today," Preston said, and returned his attention to his phone. James looked up. He was 17 years old, and he was looking at his father with an expression that had several things in it that are painful to describe. He opened his mouth. "James," his father said, without looking up. "Don't." James closed his mouth. That was the moment. That was the scene that Dorothea had been standing inside for the last 2 minutes with the ceramic serving dish in her hands. She set it down on the sideboard with the same care she had set everything down for 19 years. She folded her hands. She said, "Yes, sir." She walked back to the kitchen. She closed the door behind her, and she stood there for a moment with her hand flat on the cool tile of the counter. And she breathed. She reached up to her chest, through the collar of her uniform, and touched the brooch. The 5 petals. She counted them with her fingertip the way she had done since she was small. Faith, hope, love, dignity, and the one nobody can take. She was back at the stove when Gerald came through the door 2 minutes later. He stood in the entrance with the expression of a man who has been handed something too heavy for one person and hasn't yet figured out how to put it down. "Dorothea, I heard," she said. She didn't turn around. "I'll have everything together by end of day." Gerald stood there a moment longer. "I'm sorry," he said. "I want you to know that." She turned to look at him then. "I know you are," she said. And she meant it. "Don't you worry about me." But what Gerald didn't know, and what Preston Whitmore certainly didn't know, was what was already in motion. What had been in motion, in fact, for the past 6 weeks. The thing that had been set in motion not by Preston Whitmore's cruelty but by his daughter's love. Remember that. Because what happened next would change everything. What no one at that breakfast table knew, what Preston Whitmore had never been told, because Dorothea had not told anyone except one person, and that person had held the secret with the ferocity of someone guarding a sacred thing, was what had happened 2 months earlier, on a Thursday afternoon in August. Olivia Whitmore had called from Atlanta. She called Dorothea every few weeks, the way she had since she left for college, not with the careful filial duty of a daughter calling a parent, but with the ease of someone calling the person in the world they most want to talk to. She asked about the garden and about James's guitar playing and about what was growing in the kitchen right now and whether the cardinal was still coming to the feeder. And then she had said, "I need to tell you something." There was something in her voice that Dorothea recognized. It was the voice of someone preparing to hand you something fragile. "Tell me," Dorothea had said. "I've been doing a project," Olivia said, "for my African American Studies class, on matrilineal legacy, on women in the South who built things quietly without credit. And I started doing some research. And Dee, that was what Olivia had called her since she was small. Not Miss Dorothea, not Mrs. May, just Dee, the way a daughter shortens a name. I started looking into your family." A silence. "Olivia, I know you didn't ask me to. I know that. But I need you to hear this." And so Dorothea had sat down at the kitchen island in the house she was being asked to leave before she had any idea she was about to be asked, and she had listened. Olivia had found the record. She had found, through the Claiborne County Courthouse archives and a genealogical database that a university librarian had helped her navigate, the full documented history of the May family. What she had found was not what either of them had expected. What she had found was this: Dorothea's grandmother, Dottie May, the original, had not been simply a woman in a small town in Mississippi. She had been the founder, in 1952, of the Claiborne County Free Health Clinic, the first community health clinic in the county, which had operated without interruption for 22 years and had served, by the documented count of its own records, over 11,000 patients who had no other access to care. She had funded it herself for the first 3 years, with savings from her work as a domestic, and had then rebuilt it through a network of community donations and one significant grant from a foundation that had heard about her work from a doctor who had volunteered there one summer. The clinic had closed in 1974 when Dottie May's health had failed, but the building still stood. And in 2019, a public health foundation in Jackson had begun the process of having it named to the Mississippi Register of Historic Preservation, a process that had stalled because no one could locate any living descendants of Dottie May to complete the documentation, until Olivia had walked into a university library with a name and an old photograph. There was more. There was the question of a land grant, improperly recorded in 1961, that had been the subject of a civil rights-era property claim that had never been fully resolved, the kind of legal loose end that sits in county records for decades waiting for someone to look at it directly. There was the question of the foundation's current project, which was not merely a historical designation, but an active proposal to reestablish the Claiborne County Free Clinic under a new name, with a $1 million endowment already secured from a health equity fund contingent on one thing: a living descendant willing to serve as the legacy steward of the Dottie May name. "They've been looking for you," Olivia had said. "For 2 years, Dee. They've been looking for you." Dorothea had sat in the kitchen with the phone in her hand for a long time after she understood what she was hearing. She was the granddaughter of the woman who had built the first free clinic in Claiborne County. She was the inheritor of a legacy that had been quietly documented, quietly honored, and quietly waiting for her to step into it. She was not a housekeeper who was about to be dismissed before a man finished his coffee. She was the last May. There was a lawyer in Jackson already handling the land claim. There was a foundation director who had emailed Olivia 3 times and was waiting for a phone call. There was a news story in the making that 2 journalists had already inquired about but had been held, waiting for the family's blessing. Olivia had been waiting to tell her in person, wanting to come home for fall break to sit with her at the kitchen table and give her all of it. But fall break was 3 weeks away. And so she had called. And she had told Dorothea all of it over the phone on a Thursday afternoon in August, and Dorothea had wept in a way she had not wept in years. Not from sorrow, but from something that has no clean name, that is closest to the feeling of being found. "I've been in contact with a man named Mr. Calvin Reese," Olivia had told her. "He's the attorney handling the property claim and the foundation liaison. He wants to talk to you." "Does your father know any of this?" Dorothea had asked. "No," Olivia had said. "I wanted to tell you first. It's your story. It's yours." Dorothea had called Calvin Reese the following Monday. He was a quiet man, methodical, with the patient cadence of someone who has spent years working on cases that the world hasn't caught up to yet. He had walked her through the documentation, the land claim, the foundation proposal, the historical designation. All of it with the care of someone presenting someone with a map to a place they belong. They had spoken for 3 hours. By the end of that call, a process had been set in motion. Not a confrontation, not a claim, just the slow, steady movement of the truth toward the surface. The Foundation wanted to announce the project on November 15th. A ceremony in Jackson. Her presence requested. Her name, in full, Dorothea Elaine May, granddaughter of Dottie May, the woman who built the first free clinic in Claiborne County, to be read aloud at a ceremony that a Mississippi senator and a national health equity organization would attend. The story would go national. The Jackson Clarion had already confirmed a front-page placement. The Associated Press had been briefed. November 15th, 11 days after the Tuesday morning when Preston Whitmore fired her over his scrambled eggs, she did not tell him. This is the part that matters. This is the part that, when you understand it, tells you everything about who Dorothea May was. She gathered her things. She completed her paperwork with Gerald, who could barely look at her the whole time, who kept starting to say things and stopping himself. She packed her small canvas bag, the same canvas bag she had carried through that door 19 years ago, and she called a car. Before she left, she did 3 things. She left a detailed note in the pantry about the furnace filter and the quirk with the second dishwasher. She watered the plant on the kitchen windowsill that nobody else remembered to water, and she sat down at the kitchen island and wrote James a note on a piece of paper she took from the notepad she kept in her bag. She told him that his guitar playing was not as bad as he thought it was. She told him to keep going. She signed it the way she signed everything personal, with 2 words, D. May. She was at the back door, bag in hand, when she heard Preston come into the kitchen. She didn't turn around immediately. She heard him open the refrigerator. He did not speak. She had been in that kitchen with him for 19 years, and he did not speak. Then he said, still with his back to her, "I hope you've got something else lined up." She turned. She looked at him the way you look at something you are seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time. She said, "I'm going to be just fine, Mr. Whitmore." He closed the refrigerator. He did not look at her. She went out the door. She took 2 buses home. But what she didn't know, as she sat on that second bus watching the Fairview Hills neighborhood give way to the rest of the city, was that James had found the note she left him, that he had read it twice, standing in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window, and then had gone upstairs and called his sister. That Olivia, in her Atlanta dorm room, had answered on the second ring and listened to her brother tell her what had happened, and had gone so still on the other end of the phone that James had said, "Olivia, are you there?" "I'm here," she had said. "What do we do?" he had asked. A pause, then, "Don't do anything yet. Let me make a phone call." She had called Calvin Reese, and Calvin Reese, who had been waiting patiently for the truth to reach the surface, had said 4 words. "I think it's time. Go back to that moment if you can. Go back to the image of Dorothea May walking out of that kitchen door with her canvas bag in her hand, calm as still water, 19 years of morning coffee and biscuits and growth charts and bandaged knees and midnight vigils contained inside that quiet walk. Watch her face. Because she already knew something that Preston Whitmore did not. She had known it for 6 weeks. She had carried it pinned to the inside of her uniform, right next to the brooch that had 5 petals and 1/5 one that nobody can take. She had never needed him to know who she was. She had always known. 7 days passed. For Preston Whitmore, they were unremarkable. The resort acquisition moved forward. A new domestic service was engaged. A young woman named Christy arrived and was quiet and competent and invisible in the way he required. The working breakfasts continued. His calendar was full. He did not think about Dorothea May. Or he tried not to. There is a difference, and the people who saw him in those 7 days noted the difference in ways they did not articulate out loud. Gerald, asked to provide a handoff briefing for Christy, had found himself writing 6 single-spaced pages of operational notes about a house he had managed for 3 years, most of them attributed to previous protocols established by senior staff. He did not name Dorothea, but anyone reading the document would understand that whoever had established those protocols had understood the house in a way that took years. James had been quieter than usual. He had eaten his breakfast at the kitchen island for 7 days, by himself, and had not spoken much. When his father asked him on Thursday evening if something was wrong, James had looked at him with the expression he'd had on the Tuesday morning and said, "I don't know, Dad, is something wrong?" Preston had told him to get some sleep. Harrison, who had been at the table that morning and had said nothing, had gone back to the office and had been efficient and closed and occupied with the acquisition in a way that left no room for anything else, which was also a kind of answer. On the 8th day, Olivia came home. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with a weekend bag and the specific quality of energy that belongs to someone who is holding something important with care. She hugged Gerald at the door. She hugged James with the length and force of someone who has been waiting to. She found her father in his study, knocked, and sat across from him for 20 minutes in a conversation that Gerald, passing in the hallway, could not hear the content of, but could read the register of from the quality of the silence that preceded each exchange. What she told her father was not everything. Not yet. She told him only that she had been working on a research project and that there were some developments he should be aware of, and that she wanted him to come downstairs on Saturday morning, because there was going to be a breakfast and some people were going to be there that he needed to meet. Preston Whitmore, who was not a man accustomed to being managed, looked at his 19-year-old daughter and said, "What people?" Olivia looked back at him with the calm that was, if you had known her mother, unmistakably Catherine Whitmore's calm, the stillness that precedes the thing that cannot be moved. "People who matter," she said. "People who should have been introduced a long time ago." He said, "Olivia, Saturday morning," she said, 7 o'clock. "I made biscuits." She got up and left his study. He sat there for a moment. Then he opened his calendar and blocked the time. He did not know what it was, but he knew his daughter. And something in him, a thing that still remembered how to know, understood that she was not arranging a social call. Saturday morning arrived. The breakfast room was set the way it had been set for 10,000 other mornings in that house. The good dishes, the linen napkins, the orange juice freshly squeezed. Christy had done the setup at Olivia's instruction, and Olivia had done it the way Dorothea had taught her. The way you do things when you understand that the how is part of the what. James was already at the table when Preston came downstairs. Harrison had been called home, Olivia had called him herself on Wednesday night, and he was there too, in a chair on the far side of the table that put the window light behind him and his father in front. Gerald was standing by the pantry door, because someone had told him to be there, and because. Although he would not have been able to explain it precisely, he understood that he was meant to witness what was about to happen. Preston walked into the room and looked at the table, and then at his daughter, who was standing by the sideboard with a coffee cup, and the expression of someone who has arrived exactly where they intended. Then he looked toward the door. Dorothea May was standing in it. She was not in a uniform. She was wearing a deep navy dress, and her hair was arranged the way it was on Sundays, and on the lapel of her dress, on the outside, visible and clear, was the small gold magnolia brooch, the one with 5 petals, the one she had worn on the inside for 19 years. Standing next to her was a man in a charcoal suit, Calvin Reese attorney, whose card was already on the breakfast table, and whose presence in this house carried with it 4 years of patient work and 30 pages of documentation. And standing on Dorothea's other side was a woman from the Associated Press who had been waiting, professionally and without impatience, for this story to be ready to be told. Preston Whitmore's face went through several things in the space of 3 seconds. The first was confusion, which was unfamiliar to it. The second was the beginning of the executive composure that had served him in boardrooms and depositions and every room in which he had ever been challenged. The third was something that came after and moved differently, something slower, something that seemed to arrive from somewhere deeper, the way a tide arrives. His color changed, not dramatically, not theatrically, but changed. He looked at his daughter. "Dad," Olivia said, and her voice was steady and warm and completely without apology, "there are some things you need to know." She told him. She told him about Dottie May and the free clinic. She told him about the 11,000 patients and the 22 years and the 1952 foundation and the land grant claim and the historical designation. She told him about the Associated Press story and the Mississippi senator and the November 15th ceremony in Jackson. She told him about the $2, $1 million endowment, and the new clinic that was going to be built and named. And then Calvin Reese opened the folder he had carried under his arm and laid 3 documents on the table in front of Preston Whitmore. The first was the historical designation application, with Dorothea's full name printed at the top as the petitioning family representative. The second was the land claim summary, the property matter that had been unresolved for 60 years, which, now that a living May descendant had been identified and was represented by counsel, was about to become a good deal more resolved. The third was a letter from the Mississippi Secretary of State's office. Preston Whitmore read it. He read it once, and then again. His face did not collapse. He was not a man whose face collapsed. But it drained of something. The thing it drained of was the particular configuration that is authority without accountability, the settled certainty of a man who has never once been wrong about what someone was worth in the moment he decided. 19 years. She had been in his house for 19 years. She had made his coffee and raised his children and kept his house, and she had been, in that entire time, the granddaughter of the woman who had built the first free health clinic in Claiborne County, Mississippi. A woman whose name was going to be on a building, whose face was going to be in the Associated Press, whose legacy had been quietly multiplying in county records and foundation. Endowments and a senator's remarks while she ironed his shirts and made biscuits from scratch. He had dismissed her, in front of people. Before he finished his coffee, he looked up from the documents. Dorothea May was looking at him from the doorway, in her navy dress with her bruque on the outside, and she had the same expression she'd had the morning he fired her. Calm, complete, not triumphant, that would have required her to need something from him that she didn't need. She was simply present. She was simply herself, which was more than enough, which had always been more than enough, which he had not known because he had never once taken the time to look. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, and her voice was the same voice it had always been. Quiet, warm, unhurried, the voice that had told 3 children about cardinals and cold butter and the best baker in Claiborne County. "I didn't come here to embarrass you. I want you to know that." "Then why did you come?" Preston said. His voice was smaller than usual. He seemed to notice this. Dorothea looked at his children. At Harrison, who was staring at his father with something on his face that might take him years to fully understand. At James, who was looking at her with the pure, uncomplicated love that a 17-year-old can still feel without needing to name it. At Olivia, who was standing by the sideboard with her chin lifted and her eyes bright and her mother's calm wrapped around her like armor. "Because they asked me to," she said. "Because this family asked me to, the story broke on November 15th as scheduled. The Associated Press ran it under the headline Legacy Restored, Granddaughter of Mississippi Civil Rights Health Pioneer Recognized After Decades of Service. It was picked up by 47 outlets in the first 8 hours. By noon it was trending. By evening it had been read 4 million times. The Jackson Clarion ran a photograph on the front page of Dorothea May standing at the podium in Jackson, in her navy dress with her brooch on the outside, with the Mississippi State Senator on her right and Calvin Reese on her left. Behind her, a banner with the name that the foundation had been waiting 3 years to unveil, the Dottie May Community Health Center. The video clip from the ceremony, specifically the moment when Dorothea spoke about her grandmother, was shared by 112,000 people on a single platform in a single day. She did it quietly, Dorothea said at the podium. She never made it about herself. She just showed up, every day, and did what needed doing. And she told me there were 5 things you carry. Faith, hope, love, dignity, and the 5th one, she said, is the one nobody can take from you. That's your name. She touched the brooch. She was right about all 5. Within 24 hours of the story running, 3 things happened at the Whitmore Group. The first was that Keisha Okafor, who had been at the working breakfast, forwarded the app story to the company's HR department with a brief and carefully worded note about the circumstances of Dorothea May's termination. HR escalated it to legal. Legal called the general counsel at home on a Sunday morning. The second was that the story reached a journalist at a national business publication who had been working a separate piece on labor practices at Whitmore Group subsidiaries, and who found the timing, let us say, instructive. That piece ran 4 days later. The third was that Preston Whitmore received a call from the board, not from one member, from 3, on the same day. The labor attorney retained by Dorothea at Calvin Reese's referral sent a formal letter to the Whitmore Group on November 17th. The letter noted, with the precision that good labor attorneys deploy like a scalpel, that the circumstances of Dorothea May's termination, the manner of it, the timeline, the absence of any documented performance concerns in 19 years of employment. The witnesses to the event, the documented remarks made at the same table that morning, suggested an exposure that the Whitmore Group's legal team would want to examine carefully. The Whitmore Group's legal team examined it, carefully, at length, with the kind of attention that is only produced by genuine concern. The matter was resolved privately within 3 weeks, by an agreement that included terms that are not public record, but that Calvin Reese, who reviewed it on Dorothea's behalf, described in a phone call to Olivia as everything she asked for, and then some. Gerald was not fired. He had in fact submitted a formal internal memo documenting his objections to the termination at the time it occurred. A fact that emerged during the legal process and that reflected well on him and less well on the culture that had required him to document his objections rather than simply voice them and be heard. That culture was, as a result of the board's attention, the subject of a third-party workplace culture review conducted by an outside firm, the findings of which were also not public, but which precipitated the departure of 2 senior managers and a rewrite of the company's domestic staff employment policies. Harrison Whitmore, who had sat at that table and said nothing, had a private conversation with his father that lasted 90 minutes behind a closed door. Nobody knows what was said in that room. What emerged from it was a man who was quieter than he had been, and a father who had lost something, not his company, not his position, not his wealth, but something harder to name and harder to rebuild. The certainty, the unexamined certainty that his assessment of other people's worth was accurate and final and required no review. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the thing that was most worth taking. On November 20th, Preston Whitmore made a personal call to Dorothea May. She answered on the 3rd ring. He said what he needed to say, without preamble and without excuse, in the way that people sometimes manage to speak when they have lost the ability to perform. She listened. When he was finished, she said, "I know. That was all." It was enough. He donated $750,000 to the Dottie Mae Community Health Center's capital campaign 3 weeks later. No announcement, no press, no naming opportunity attached. Calvin Reese confirmed the gift was clean. That too is not nothing. The Dottie Mae Community Health Center opened on April 3rd. It was in Claiborne County, Mississippi, on the same road where the original clinic had stood. In a new building with large windows that let in the morning light and a garden in the back that a local landscape architect had designed to be maintained by community volunteers. The examination rooms were named, not for donors. For patients, names drawn from the original clinic's records, the names of the 11,000 people who had come through the first clinic's doors in 22 years and received care they would not otherwise have had. The name above the main entrance read, Dorothy May Foundation Free Health Center, established in honor of Dottie May, 1952 and 2024. In the lobby there was a glass case. Inside it, the original clinic's handwritten patient ledger from 1954, a photograph of Dottie May at the original building, and a small reproduction of a gold magnolia brooch with 5 petals and a note that read, in Dorothea May's handwriting, Faith, Hope, Love, Dignity, and Your Name. Olivia spoke at the opening ceremony. She was 20 years old and she stood at that podium without notes and spoke for 12 minutes about legacy and about the things that are passed down not through wills or trusts, but through presence, through the accumulation of mornings, through the willingness to show up and do what needs doing without requiring credit or recognition. She spoke about her mother, who she had not stopped missing, and about the woman who had raised her in the years after, and about what it means to be a daughter. She did not cry until she was finished. Then she did, briefly, and it was the right kind. James was there. He had driven down from Fairview Hills with Gerald, who had come at Dorothea's personal invitation and who stood in the back of the room with his arms folded and his eyes red and said nothing to anyone but squeezed Dorothea's hand when he passed her on the way out and held on for a moment longer than the squeeze required. Harrison was there. He stood next to his father, who was in the third row, and neither of them spoke much. But they were there. That matters. Where you are when it counts is its own kind of statement. Dorothea May was appointed the executive director of the Dorothy May Foundation. The salary was $94,000 per year, plus benefits, which she did not mention to anyone except Olivia, who laughed with the particular delight of someone hearing something long overdue. She moved back to Mississippi, to a house 40 minutes from Claiborne County, with a garden that she planned to start in the spring. The clinic sees patients 3 days a week. It is fully staffed by a rotating team of volunteer physicians, nurse practitioners, and community health workers. With one full-time coordinator, a young woman named Amara who had heard the app story in November and sent a cold email in January that was answered within 48 hours. The waiting room has chairs with good padding and a window that looks out onto the garden. There are magazines that are less than 3 months old. There is a coffee station in the corner that is fully stocked, and above it, a small typed card that reads, "You are welcome here." 11,000 people came through the first clinic's doors in 22 years. The new clinic's capacity is projected at 800 patients per year. The math is simple. The math is the whole point. On the wall of the waiting room, at eye level, next to the window, there is a framed photograph. It is not Dottie May, though her portrait hangs in the lobby. This photograph is smaller, more private. Dorothea May at the kitchen island in the Whitmore house 19 years ago, with 4-year-old Harrison standing next to her watching her make biscuits, his small chin in his palms. Paying attention to everything. She is looking at the camera. She does not know she is being photographed. Her face, unguarded and unself-conscious, holds the expression of someone who is exactly where they belong, doing exactly what they were made to do. She gave the Whitmore children a copy of the photograph. She kept one for herself. She gave the foundation the third. It is the first thing you see when you walk through the door. If this story moved you the way it moved me, if you found yourself holding your breath through that breakfast room and exhaling in that Mississippi clinic, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told. And before you go, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever had your value dismissed by someone who never took the time to look? Have you ever held your dignity quietly, privately, the way Dorothea held that brooch on the inside of her uniform for 19 years, because the room wasn't ready for you yet to wear it on the outside? Tell me in the comments. I want to read every single one. But here's what really gets me. Here's the thing I keep coming back to when I think about Dorothea May. She never needed to be dramatic. She never needed to announce herself. She didn't walk back into that house with lawyers and a press release and the righteous anger that most of us would have felt and many of us would have shown. She walked in because her children, and they were her children in every way that matters, asked her to. That was enough. That was the whole reason. And when Preston Whitmore, that silver-haired man who had moved through rooms his whole life as though they were constructed specifically to receive him, when he read those documents and looked up at the woman he had dismissed before his coffee cooled, she told him she hadn't come to embarrass him. She meant it. That's not restraint. That's not strategy. That is the character of a person who spent 61 years understanding that your worth is not determined by the room's willingness to recognize it. She already knew. She had always known. The brooch was on the inside because she wasn't wearing it for him. She was wearing it for herself. I want to ask you something personal, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to decide whether to put the brooch on the outside, where you had the knowledge, the proof, the standing, and you could have used it as a weapon, but you chose to use it as a door instead? What did you do, and whatever you did, do you think it was right? Leave me that answer. Because that's the conversation worth having. This is the story of Dorothea Elaine May, granddaughter of Dottie May, daughter of Claiborne County, and the woman who raised 3 children who were not hers by blood, and gave them something that no estate, no acquisition, no 11,000 square foot house in Fairview Hills could have given them. The knowledge of what it looks like to be dignified and patient and completely, irreducibly yourself in a world that keeps asking you to be less. 5 petals. You know what they are. The 5th one is yours.